Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar, Getting Out of a Funk, Tools and Tips to Manage Depression. Maybe you've been feeling a little bit disconnected from the people around you, or perhaps you've been having trouble feeling motivated to get things done, or you're even just kind of having an off week. You might not feel you aren't quite depressed, but you've definitely felt better. It happens to the best of us, and with current circumstances, it's completely normal. I know that's how I've been feeling for the past few weeks, so it's a common feeling that a lot of people are having, especially with everything that's been going on in the world. So it's okay if you have felt feelings of depression creep in or increase over the last few months. But the great news is that there's a lot of tools that can help you feel better. And so today we're going to be sharing with you different mechanisms and resources to address and deal with symptoms of depression. And we're also going to talk about how to recognize when you may need additional support and also the value of self-compassion. And one really exciting thing that we're doing today is at the end of the webinar, we actually have clinicians who are going to be available to meet with you one-on-one to talk, listen, lend support, and offer more resources and tools. So if at any time you're interested in talking with somebody right after this webinar privately, just message us and we'll get you set up with that. Before we begin, I want to thank our financial sponsors for this webinar, the Rotary Club of Golden. Thank you, Rotary Club of Golden, for your commitment to mental health as well as to the community. I'm pleased to introduce today's speaker, Melissa Weiler-Cabral. Melissa is a licensed professional counselor here at Jefferson Center. Before I hand the mic over to Melissa, I do have a few housekeeping items to cover about the presentation. First, this webinar will be available on demand after the live session, and we'll email that out to you along with the additional resources, and we'll have a slide deck available. I would also encourage you to visit our website at jcmh.org, where you'll find out more information about how to get started if you're interested in talking with a therapist, as well as blog posts and information about upcoming webinars on other mental health topics. Please keep your microphones muted and turn off your video during the presentation. And you'll also want to change your Zoom view to speaker mode for the best viewing presentation. Next, we'd love to hear from you during today's presentation. So if you have a question for Melissa, please feel free to send it through the chat at the bottom of your player. We'll be answering questions at the end of the webinar, but if we don't get to your question today, we'll make sure we follow up afterwards. And finally, we'd like to encourage you to follow us on all of our social networks and share the recording of this webinar and other information about Jefferson Center. And so now, without any further ado, Melissa, I'll turn it over to you. Oh, Melissa, I think you're muted. You might have to unmute yourself.
There we go. Okay. All right. So thank you for coming today. Today we'll be talking obviously about depression. We'll go over the symptoms of depression, the difference between situational depression and and clinical depression or major depression, and then some coping skills, things you can do for self-care, and how you can help other people that may also be struggling with depression. And then I'm happy to answer any questions at the end. So to get started, first let's talk about a working definition of depression. So depression is a very common, but also serious mental illness that negatively impacts how you feel, the way you think, and how you act. So these are the main criteria for depression. It's important to note that you do not, under any circumstances, need all of these to receive a diagnosis of depression. So I'll go over each of these a little bit more in depth, just to give you an idea of what to look for in yourself and others, like family members, children, so you can help recognize the signs. So the first is depressed mood. But that doesn't just mean feeling down and sad and in the dumps. It can also include emptiness. A lot of clients I work with describe it as feeling blank or empty or just blah. It can also encompass irritability and anger. And it's important to note that in children and adolescents, irritability and anger is a more predominant affect presentation rather than like this sadness or tearfulness that adults might present with. The next is loss of interest, or also known as anhedonia. The clinical term is anhedonia. And this is a very marked diminished interest or pleasure in all or almost all activities. So for kids, it might be a kid who is really into soccer and loved going to practice and loved his teammates might not really want to go to practice anymore, and soccer is stupid, and I just want to stay home. For an adult, that can look like you used to go for a walk every Friday morning with some friends, and that just doesn't really sound good to you anymore. Or family gatherings. You might avoid some of those because it's just stressful and you don't want to deal with it. And so it's a loss of enjoyment. A lot of people describe it too as not being able to feel positive emotions. You feel muted almost. So if something good does happen in your life, instead of feeling this huge, like, yay, euphoric kind of happiness, it's more like, oh, that was neat. And it's very subdued. The next is weight loss or significant changes in appetite. So changes in appetite can be over or under eating. We also describe it sometimes as emotional eating. Under eating and weight loss, in order for that to be considered clinically significant, would be losing about 5% of your body weight in 1 month without trying. And that's another key factor. If you're trying to eat healthier and be more active and you lose weight, that's not clinically significant. What's clinically significant is when you're not eating and you're losing weight without trying. So a lot of times people will say they just don't feel hungry and they have to force themselves to eat. Sometimes the energy of getting up to go make something to eat seems so daunting and overwhelming, you just can't bring yourself to do it. Or with the overeating, you grab what's readily available and you might just throw yourself into your couch and stay there for the next 6 hours and eat everything that you brought with you. So the next one, sleep problems. So having insomnia or hyperinsomnia nearly every day. Often sleep issues are the presenting complaint when people first are seeking treatment, and you might not even know you are experiencing depression yet, but your sleep is off and you know that, so you go to your doctor and maybe you're talking about your sleep changes. That's usually the one symptom that starts alerting people to the fact that something's off. You're not like you normally are. So your sleep disturbances could take the form of difficulty sleeping or excessively sleeping. So the couple of types of insomnia that are present are middle insomnia, terminal insomnia, and initial insomnia. So middle insomnia is the most prevalent one. That is where you wake up during the middle of the night and you have difficulty going back to sleep. The next is initial insomnia, which is difficulty falling asleep in the first place, but then you can stay asleep generally for the rest of the night. And then the third one, terminal insomnia, is waking too early and not going back to sleep. So maybe you have to get up at 7 a.m., but at 4:30, you're wide awake and you just can't go back to sleep. So sleep issues are really important because they impact a lot of different areas of your life. I always talk with clients about how sleep seems to be like the center or the root of a lot of different depressive symptoms. So if you're not sleeping well, you're probably more susceptible to irritability, feeling tearful. I know when I haven't gotten a good night's sleep, I'm more on edge about things. I'm more easily upset. And so if you're not sleeping well for days or weeks on end, that starts to compound. So following sleep problems is psychomotor, or I'll just jump to fatigue because I didn't order those correctly, is fatigue. So fatigue is the significant loss of energy. And it's not just feeling sleepy. It's a feeling of exhaustion that follows minimal tasks. So just getting up in the morning and getting dressed drains your whole level of energy. You feel physically exhausted. People often describe this fatigue as like feeling like there are weights in their feet or their limbs feel heavy, that it feels like every effort they make is a Herculean effort and it's exhausting. So we'll jump back now to psychomotor changes. This one is not that common. It's one of the more rare depressive symptoms. It's also one of the few symptoms, or the only symptom, that has to be observed by somebody other than yourself. So it can't be your subjective observation that you are talking or moving more slowly. It has to be, somebody has to comment to you on it and notice that your psychomotor activity is either slower or more active than usual. And what that would look like, I always describe psychomotor changes as like Eeyore from Winnie the Pooh, how he always just like slowly moves along and he talks really slowly, versus like Tigger, who's like bouncing all over the place off the walls. So I always use those to kind of describe going from maybe like a normal level of psychomotor functioning to either bouncing off the walls or moving like Eeyore. And that's what psychomotor changes is referring to. But again, a lot of times people with depression feel like they're moving or talking more slowly, but it's not presenting that way to other people. And so that's why you need another person to make the observation that, yes, you are talking or moving more slowly. The next is a big one. It's worthlessness. So it's worthlessness or excessive and inappropriate guilt. Again, nearly every day well, I guess length criteria depends on whether it's situational or clinical depression, and we'll get into that in a second. So worthlessness and excessive feelings of guilt happen when people misinterpret neutral or trivial day-to-day events and take them as a personal defect. So they exaggerate like the event happening or the severity of the event because it's a character flaw with them. So, let's say you forgot to hold the door open for somebody walking into the store, and you might think, I'm a terrible person. Now that person hates me. And I probably ruined their day because I didn't think about them. And it's this catastrophizing, spiraling thought process that's really unhealthy. And it's not true. It's irrational, right? That person probably didn't even think about it. And you just engage in how I like to describe it as self-bullying. You say things to yourself that you would never say to another person. And if you heard another person saying those things, you would tell them to stop because it's not true and it's mean. So why do we say them to ourselves? So depression is really, really often encompassed by that feeling of worthlessness. And a lot of times people with depression blame themselves for having depression in the first place, which again is out of their control. So that one is a big one. And that then leads into suicidal ideation, which we'll get to in a second. The next one is difficulty concentrating or having problems making just typical daily decisions, so indecisiveness. A lot of times you might feel like you're an airplane in a really cloudy sky where you can't really see out the window. Things are just a little hazy. And that's how people tend to describe the difficulty with concentration that is associated with depression. Also, people have issues with short-term memory. It feels almost like you hear information, but it doesn't sink in. It doesn't sit in your brain long enough to process. It's literally like that one in one ear, out the other. And you might have to hear something or read something several times before it starts to sink in and you commit it to short-term memory. A lot of times people are worried that there's something more serious going on for them because of this, and are often relieved to find out that difficulty concentrating is a pretty common symptom of depression. I will say for elderly persons, that can sometimes be indicative of dementia or Alzheimer's. And for people in that category, I always recommend that they do get evaluated by their medical doctor just to rule out any underlying medical issues like that, because 65 and older is the age we start to see some of that cognitive decline. And the last is suicidal ideation. So this includes recurrent thoughts of death. recurrent suicidal ideation without a specific plan. It can include a suicide attempt or a specific plan for suicide. This is the only symptom of depression that you do not need to experience daily in order for it to meet criteria. So all the other symptoms you have to experience pretty regularly. Suicidal ideation is concerning enough to where if you even have it just once or twice, that's a pretty big signifier that you're suffering from some kind of depression. So again, everything except suicidal ideation needs to be present for the most part every day. So moving on to situational depression. So all of the aforementioned symptoms are necessary for situational and major depressive diagnoses. The difference between them is kind of time of onset, length of onset, and severity of impact. So situational depression. This is short-term, stress-related types of depression. It develops after you experience a stressful event or series of events. It's considered a type of adjustment disorder, and the symptoms cannot be caused by another mental health disorder or part of the grieving process. Grief is not considered a mental illness. It's an unfortunate and natural part of the human experience. It's treated differently than regular depression. So symptoms of situational depression have to start within 3 months of the stressful event, and they last no longer than 6 months after the end of the stressful event. So that is the main criteria to get an adjustment disorder for depression or situational depression, is that it's time limited. So what causes situational depression? A lot of things. Relationship or marital problems, such as fighting or divorce, negative financial situations, social issues at school or at work, learning of serious health issues, and COVID-19. That's a big one, I think, for everyone right now. Since this all started, the increase in people I'm seeing who are coming in saying, I've never had depression before, but now, since losing my job, having to stay home, my kids being home all the time, my husband and I being within 5 feet of each other for 24/7, we're seeing an increase in situational depression coming in for treatment. A lot of people too are experiencing depression because maybe they didn't lose their job, but people they care about did, and they're feeling remorseful and guilty about that they're in a better situation than somebody they care about, and they're kind of guilting themselves about it. I think a lot of people might be feeling that way. I know myself, I'm a pretty empathic person. That's why I work here and help people. And it really can impact me and affect my emotions when I think about all the things that are going on in the world and all the people who are suffering due to this whole pandemic, and the unclear future that we're all moving towards is anxiety provoking and stressful. So that's a really, really healthy and normal response to everything that's going on right now. And for people who have never experienced any kind of depression, they're feeling really confused and scared, and they're coming in for treatment. And so what's important to note about situational depression, we talked about the time length of it. So it has to onset within the first 3 months of the event, and it subsides within 6 months after the end of the event. If left untreated, situational depression can lead to major depression and clinical depression. And the main difference between the two is that with situational depression, there is an identifiable stressor or trigger. Whereas with major depression, people don't know why they're feeling the way they do. So with situational depression, we'll see it a lot. I see it a lot in teenagers with like a fallout of a friend group. Those social issues at school, or they didn't get it on the sports team they wanted. And for adults, going through a divorce and having to worry about finances and custody, like those are all situational stressors. that people initially come in for. And again, those can grow into major depression if left untreated or ignored. Okay, so major depression. 7% of all US adults have experienced at least one major depressive episode in their lifetime. It's highest among adults aged 18 to 25 and is higher in women versus men. The prevalence of major depressive episodes is highest among multiracial adults. And 59% of people with depression also have anxiety. Anxiety is important to note here because it is what is considered comorbid with depression, meaning that they are often diagnosed together. It can often be a case of the chicken or the egg. The one kind of can lead to the other and vice versa. People who are experiencing both depression and anxiety will describe it sometimes as one being more prevalent than the other one day. So one day anxiety is king and the next it's depression, and they kind of feed off each other. The symptomology is really similar, with the criteria for anxiety being excessive worry and overthinking. And that you just kind of catastrophize all the time. You overthink everything. You think worst case scenario a lot. You might have a plan for every possible scenario that could happen in any given situation because you sit there and overthink it. And that type of worry exhausts you. It causes fatigue. And then you feel you can start engaging in some of that negative self-talk that's characteristic of depression, that worthlessness. And then the worthlessness leads to some suicidal ideation, and then you just kind of spiral into it. So they're very connected. And sometimes one is just worse than the other. So clinical depression is more severe than just situational depression. It's brought on without reason. And this is oftentimes the most frustrating thing I hear from clients is they're always looking for a reason for why they're feeling the way they are. There has to be a reason, and there isn't. And that is often really hard for people to accept, that you just have this. It just happened. It's not your fault. And people who are not as well educated about depression might make these people feel guilty about their depression. Why can't you just snap out of it? You know, there's a really negative stigma around it, and it's hard for people with depression to kind of break out of that thought pattern, especially if they're living with or surrounded by people who have the belief that depression is fake or it's not real or mental illnesses aren't real. But it's very real, and it's brought on without reason, and it's no one's fault. It's not the client's fault. It's not anyone's fault. It's just there. It's kind of like some physical ailments. They just happen and they suck, but it's not your fault. It's not anyone else's fault. It's also important to keep in mind and to keep in perspective that not everyone who is depressed experiences every symptom, and not everyone who has similar symptoms experience those symptoms the same. So sometimes a lot of well-meaning people will say things like, oh, well, when I was depressed, I just did this. And that's not going to work for the other person. You can experience each of those depressive symptoms very differently than somebody in your same family, your best friend, the stranger down the street. You can all struggle with issues with sleep, but experience those differently, and they can impact you differently. They can have different effects on your life differently. And there's sometimes this kind of mindset or attitude that, oh, we both have depression, so we must experience it the same way. And we can often be really invalidating to each other by making the assumption that we experience things the same way that they do. So everyone experiences depression differently. Some people might have only few symptoms, while others may experience many, but you can experience those symptoms with different severity and different intensity. So just keep that in mind when talking to yourself or with someone else experiencing depression, that it's not the same as everyone else. And maybe just because your friend got over it really well and you struggle more with it, it doesn't mean there's something wrong with you. You just experience it differently. And people with only a few symptoms but are experiencing distress from it can also benefit from treatment for mild depression. It's not just, treatment isn't just for people with really moderate or really severe depression. Treatment can be beneficial to everyone regardless of where you are on this severity scale. So there are quite a few risk factors that increase a person's kind of predisposition to experience depression. So a risk factor is a characteristic at the biological, psychological, family, community, or cultural level that are associated with higher likelihoods of negative outcomes. So the first is biochemistry. This one we can't really do a whole lot about on our own. It has to do with chemicals in your brain, and that some of those contribute to depression. The next is genetics. Similar to physical health problems, mental health problems run in families as well. It's, if you're predisposed to breast cancer in your family, you can be predisposed to depression. Things run in families. Personality. So people who are generally more pessimistic and negative tend to experience higher levels of depression, as well as people with high levels of perfectionism and sensitivity to rejection or critique. Environmental factors. So this can be things like living in an unsafe neighborhood, exposure to violence, being neglected, abused, not having access to food, clothing, shelter, water can increase your risk to depression. Those basic needs are really important. So the food, clothing, shelter, in order to be able to do some of the higher level work on our emotions and processing some of the more difficult things cognitively. Environmental factor, I just did that one. Age, so people 65 and over are at a higher risk of experiencing depression. Chronic medical conditions, so that depression might not be a symptom itself of the medical condition, but you're experiencing depression because maybe that medical condition limits your mobility and you can't do anything like you used to do anymore. I see quite a few people who come in for more specifically back injuries that happened 15, 20 years ago, and they've just never been able to get back to that level of functioning. And that has caused depression for a pretty long time. Being a sexual minority, so anyone in the LGBTQ plus community is more susceptible to depression based on discrimination. Substance use, so using any kind of substance habitually and excessively leads to depression, and it vice versa. So sometimes people start using substances because they're depressed, anxious, have another underlying mental illness. And other times people start using and then they become depressed. So they kind of have they interchange with each other in terms of causing depression or being the result of. So low SES, that kind of goes in with the food, clothing, shelter, housing. If you're having difficulty affording to provide basic needs for yourself, that leads to greater stress, financial stress. That's one of the big kind of hotspots for depression. So that's a big one. We already did age. Gender, like I mentioned earlier, females are more susceptible to depression than men are. And little or no social supports. Having no or few social supports impacts men and women equally. However, stay-at-home moms with small children are the most susceptible to this. They are the ones most likely to experience depression because they feel isolated and alone compared to women with children who work and have a supportive network at their places of employment. Okay, so ways to help yourself. Some of these you've probably seen before. but they're still tried and true. So getting exercise. This doesn't have to be like, hitting the weights and, doing 30 squats and then running a mile and doing jumping jacks. It can honestly be as simple as walking around your house to make sure you get extra steps in. I don't know about any of you, but I have a Fitbit and I really like to track my steps. So at night when I'm watching TV, I kind of just pace around my house listening to the TV so I can get some light movement in while I'm also watching TV. So it doesn't have to be anything really rigorous. If you can do more vigorous activity, fantastic, good for you. I recommend you do it. If you can't, fantastic, don't. Do something that you can do. Whatever works for you is what's going to be best. Establishing healthy sleeping habits. So this one, I think when the pandemic hit and people lost their jobs or, the whole world was in a snow globe and it just got shaken really hard and nobody knew what to do anymore, people really struggled with this one. It's important that we still go to bed and wake up at the same times every day. It helps keep your body on a biological rhythm, which naturally helps produce melatonin, which is the hormone that helps you fall asleep at night. So the more you can kind of keep yourself on a routine with sleep, the better. The next is eating more healthfully and mindfully. Easier said than done when you're at home and your refrigerator full of goodies is right there. But if you can, try to put more healthy things in your fridge rather than, I don't know about anyone else, but my guilty pleasure is double stuffed chocolate Oreos. And so I don't keep those around anymore because it took about 3 weeks of pandemic eating for me to realize that's not maybe the best thing to do. So now I keep fresh fruit around, but you can make small changes like that can really have a big impact on your health. Just eating more apples or plums or nectarines or whatever fruit is in season can have a big impact on your physical health and your overall well-being. And then eating more mindfully. So that means not rushing through your meal, actually maybe closing your eyes and savoring each bite can bring you some greater satisfaction out of the things you're eating, and help you to not overeat if that's one of the symptoms maybe you're experiencing. Strengthening your social support system. That one is really tricky right now. You have to get creative with it. So that can be joining a virtual group. I know Jefferson Center has some wellness classes that are being done virtually. I know there are lots of other places around town that have moved their stuff online because we can't meet in person. And even though it's not the same as being in person, it's better than nothing, because not having any social interaction, regardless of the method, is more detrimental than having some interaction, even if it's done by Zoom. And what I would recommend doing is setting up almost a weekly hangout with a friend or a group of friends and treat it like an important appointment. It's something you can't miss. It's something you have to do because it's what's really good for you. One of the things a couple of coworkers and I started doing after we stopped being able to see each other at work is every other Thursday, we have a 3-hour kind of Zoom meeting on Thursdays where we watch House Hunters International on HGTV and make fun of it. And that's what the three of us like to do because we just miss each other and we don't get to see anyone else except our spouses and our pets. And so it's a great way for us to still connect on something as mundane as a television show and still feel connected without having to be in person. So that's one of the things I kind of figured out for myself. Maybe that's something that you or your children or teenagers could figure out. It's just important to have that consistent connection regardless of how you do it. Also, chat rooms have become a thing again for the same reason that people are looking to connect with people who are stuck at home and you just want to talk to someone. It doesn't even matter about what. So there's lots of options out there. You just kind of have to get a little creative and set realistic goals for yourself. So it would be awesome if you were like, I'm going to do those first 4 things that Melissa talked about. I'm going to do them every day and my life's going to be amazing. The reality is if you make too many changes at once, you're not going to keep up with them. So set a realistic goal for yourself. Pick one of the things that I go over today and make a commitment to integrating that into your life. Maybe once a day, depending on what it is, or once a week, or once a month. But set a goal that you can achieve. You don't want to set yourself up for failure by setting the goal of doing all 4 of those things every day for the next month, because then you're most likely not going to meet those, and then you're going to feel worse than you did before you got started. So it's important to make sure your goals are realistic and manageable and not overwhelming. I don't want to stress you out anymore. Reading. This is one that people have gotten back into more and more as well. Reading something funny if you're feeling depressed might be helpful. Reading satire. I don't know about any of you. I love the website The Onion, and there's satire articles. Sometimes, fiction and nonfiction are you can't tell the difference, but I like humor. Humor is one that I use for myself as well. And I'll just go ahead and jump to humor since that's already on there. There's been some recent research that was published in February in I can't remember the name of the journal. I found it on Neuroscience News, that did some research on how depression memes impact people with depression. And so it can be kind of a dark humor. A lot of people think depression humor is dark and not funny, and we shouldn't laugh about that. But people with depression actually rated those memes really highly and reported that they felt a greater sense of connection to other people by seeing memes kind of poking fun of depression. Like one of the ones I saw that I laughed at when I was creating this presentation was, I don't think I struggle with depression anymore. I'm really good at depression. I've got that thing down. And I thought it was funny because you're making fun of something very serious, but we often talk about cognitive reframes in counseling, and that to me was a positive reframe. You're really good at depression, instead of using that as a negative kind of characterization of yourself. So some of that darker humor for people with depression actually is showing to be positive for people with depression, because it can help shift the way you view what you're dealing with. Like another one I saw was a Grumpy Cat, and it says, "I'm not angry, I'm just happiness challenged," which I thought was another kind of funny and cute way to reframe having depression. So some of that type of humor can be really beneficial to people suffering with depression. Journaling is another really helpful skill or tool to use, and not typing, handwriting. It has to be a handwritten journal entry. And the reason for that is when you physically handwrite something, 1, it helps you with memory. 2, it forces you to physiologically slow down your heart rate, because you're slowing down to think things through. It slows down your mind. So if you're having racing, anxious thoughts, it helps calm that down. And so it provides not just a place for you to get out what's happening in your head, but it also provides a physiological reduction in stress. But it has to be handwriting. Typing, you can go too fast. I can type fast enough to keep up with my thoughts. That's not relaxing. So, and it doesn't always have to be a journal entry in the sense of, "Dear diary, today is day 97 of quarantine." You can make it fun. One of the things I like to do with kids in therapy is write fictional stories about our lives. So instead of writing about, their teenage self with anxiety, they create another character who might have anxiety, and they write stories about them, about that character, but it's also drawing from experiences that they've experienced in their life. And so it's a way of still processing your feelings without necessarily being so intrusive, I want to say. So it's a way to get things out without necessarily having to call yourself out on things. Creating structure and routine for yourself. Humans are creatures of habit. We love consistency and routine, even if we want to pretend that we are fun and spontaneous, which we can sometimes be, but our natural state of being thrives off consistency and structure and routine. And what's important right now, kind of given the snow globe shakeup that's happened is creating that for yourself. It doesn't have to be super important tasks. You can just create, a structure for yourself that's, I'm going to do one load of laundry, or I'm going to go for a walk, or I'm going to make dinner Monday, Wednesday, Friday, instead of, reaching for the bag of potato chips. Creating some semblance of structure and routine gives yourself a sense of purpose. And for people struggling with depression who often feel they don't have a purpose or they feel lost, this is really important. And this is also one of those things that even if you're not struggling with depression right now, you're going to still benefit from having a structure and routine for yourself, for your children, for anyone else coming into contact with you or living in your home. We as humans love structure and routine and consistency. And the last two, counseling and medications. So when do you get counseling? When do you seek counseling? My kind of rule of thumb is that everyone should go to counseling for every reason because I totally believe in its effectiveness. But if you're like never been to therapy before, or you're not sure what it's going to be like, but some of those symptoms I talked about seem really familiar, I would come in and just get an evaluation. You don't have to engage in therapy. You can make an appointment with an intake clinician, come in, talk about what's going on, get some guidance, get some coping skills and some tips, and choose to not come to counseling. I think if you're questioning whether or not you should get counseling, that's generally a sign that you should at least come in to talk to someone briefly. You might not need, reoccurring sessions, but oftentimes people just feel good coming into the intake and finally verbalizing all the things they've been feeling and maybe holding in. So if you're thinking about counseling, come into counseling. The biggest issues too are if you have any kind of suicidal ideation, come in and talk to someone. And if you're noticing your sleep is all of a sudden really helter skelter, come in. Those are the biggest kind of symptoms from that first page that if not addressed in some way can be life-threatening. Without sleep, a lot of our other kind of functions go out the window, and that just increases our chance for all those other symptoms, the teariness, the loss of interest, the isolation, the withdrawing. So talk to someone if you're experiencing either of those as well. And then medications. So medications aren't the answer for everyone. Research does show that the best outcome for people suffering from depression is counseling in conjunction with medication management, but I've seen people do well with just one or the other. So meds are always there if you want them. You also don't have to take them. Okay, so what can you do to help someone else? If you're concerned that somebody you care about is suffering from depression, or you're noticing some of those symptoms we went over on the first page, you want to set a time to talk to them, and you want to make sure you don't have any distractions. So put the phone away, turn it off, turn off the TV, put the small kids down for a nap if you're talking to a teenager or your spouse. Set aside some one-on-one quality time. The second, let them talk as little or as much as they want to. Forcing people to talk about things they're maybe not ready to talk about only shuts them down further. So you're there to just be a support and say, hey, I'm noticing this is happening for you. Talk to me. And they might not that at that time, but it could very well be that the next time they see you, they want to say something, or they think about it and I should tell that person what's happening for me. Don't diagnose. Can't stress this one enough. I'm an intake clinician at Jefferson Center, so my job is to provide an initial diagnosis. And there's kind of a joke we have about how often we undiagnose people with something they're convinced they have. So don't diagnose someone, leave it to us, because people often wear those diagnoses like badges. It's, I've got depression, and that might not be what it is, and they start to really strongly identify with it, and it can be really detrimental to their self-esteem and sense of self-worth. So don't diagnose, just listen carefully, listen thoughtfully, use open-ended questions So one of the things I learned to utilize when I was in grad school and has proven to be really, really helpful throughout my professional career is I actually don't ask questions for the most part. I say, tell me about this. You mentioned the XYZ. Tell me about that more. Tell me how that impacts what's going on for you. Tell me how that's changing things for you. I use more of a directive statement to guide them instead of asking a yes or no question where they can easily go, no. And that just shuts down that conversation right away. So using open-ended questions or directive open-ended statements is really helpful in getting people to open up without being forceful or pushy. Listen carefully, so validate what they're saying. Use reflective statements. Oh, wow, I'm hearing you say this has been really hard for you. Well, that must have been terrible for you. I'm sorry you experienced that. How can I help? That kind of thing. And then offer to help in seeking professional support. A lot of times, what prevents people from seeking help is fear. I can't tell you how many times I've asked about suicidal ideation in my office, and I can see the fear pass over my client's face with they're like, you're going to hospitalize me. And just having suicidal thoughts does not mean you are going to be hospitalized. That you can have passive suicidal thoughts and not be hospitalized. There's a great misunderstanding about that, but there's a lot of fear that keeps people from seeking professional help when they need it because they're not sure what's going to happen. So offer to come to the appointment. I have people all the time who bring someone, and sometimes they come into the office and sometimes they sit in the waiting room. It's up to the client. But whatever the client chooses, I'm going to be okay with, because what's important is that they're here and they're getting help. So offer to seek help. You can come to the appointment, help them make the appointment. That also happens. Friends will help other friends call. They'll sit there while they talk to our navigation clinicians and get set up for an appointment. There's a lot of things you can do to be a support for someone else. If things are really bad and the person you're talking to or you yourself are at a point where you feel overwhelmed and you cannot handle what's happening or what you're feeling, you can walk in or call our crisis line 24/7, 365. I put our Jefferson Center managed location down, the address is down there on the bottom of the screen. The staff there I work with personally every day. They are phenomenal. They're wonderful crisis clinicians. A crisis doesn't have to mean a life or death situation. A crisis is something that is just uncomfortable and overwhelming for you or your family member or your friend. We're not going to turn you away and say, sorry, that's not really a crisis. Okay. So if you are experiencing some kind of meltdown or just an overwhelming sense of stress, please come in and talk to someone and we'll get you set up and get you where you need to go within Jefferson Center so that you can get the help you need. So one last statistic I want to kind of give you all before I sign off is that people on average wait 10 years before seeking professional help for mental illnesses. 10 years of their life is spent struggling alone. That is a astounding number. I've seen that in research multiple times, and this is why, like, if you are even considering thinking about counseling, don't wait 10 years. Don't let 10 years of your life be kind of taken over by something that we can treat and work on. So on that note, that is the end of my presentation. Please feel free to take note of my email address. If you have any questions that come up after we all sign off, I'm happy to answer them at any point in time. And I think now we're going to answer any questions that may have come in during the presentation.
Yep, we sure are. Thank you, Melissa. That was a really great presentation. I know I found a lot of very valuable information in it, and I'm sure others did as well. I do want to mention before we get to the questions that, as I said before, if you are interested in, just chatting with a clinician, if you have more questions that you want to ask one-on-one, or, you're feeling again, a little bit off or depressed and you want to talk to somebody individually, just message us, private message us, and we will get you set up with somebody right after this is over. But Melissa, we did get a couple of questions. So the first one is, I've been feeling pretty listless the past couple of weeks, and I know that I should be doing stuff like exercising or eating well, but I just can't get off the couch or out of bed to do those things, even though I know they're good for me. How do I get over that hurdle?
So what I would recommend, I mean, if it's, that sounds pretty significant. And I mean, if the motivation piece, I'm hearing a lot of people talk about lately, and is finding that motivation to get off the couch and do what you need to do, even though you know you need to do it. Doing it's a different story is really difficult. I would really recommend making an appointment and coming in and talking to someone about that, because if it's to the point where the motivation piece is so diminished that you're struggling that much, it sounds like you're walking more towards the moderate type of depression, and you might need a more higher level of care than just yourself right now. But one thing that I do for myself and for clients when that feeling is really overwhelming for me is I kind of set up a reward system for myself, kind of like the way you'd set up a sticker chart for a child. It's like, if I get up and do this one thing, then I can reward myself with this other thing. And I kind of hold myself accountable to not getting, my reward if I don't do it. But that sometimes can help me overcome some of that listlessness, and clients as well, with just trying to provide some form of motivation for you. And if that point in time, it's like for me, I'm highly motivated by Oreos. So for me, getting up and exercising means I get to eat Oreos, and I love Oreos. So finding something like that for yourself where you can reward yourself for doing even just something small is going to help reinforce that behavior and that pattern. But I would also really recommend coming in and talking to someone.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Figuring out what a good reward would be for yourself. That seems like that might work. So the next question we have is, I'm worried about my husband. He's just seemed kind of sad and down recently, but every time I've asked him about it, all he does is says he's fine and brush it off. I'm starting to get frustrated, and how can I help him?
That one's really hard with spouses because they're adults, right? If it was a kid, you could just bring him in.
Mm-hmm.
What I would do if I were in your situation, what I would recommend is kind of going along with don't push it. Don't force him to talk about something he's not ready to. What I would rather recommend is say, I'm noticing that you're doing this more. I'm noticing you're more irritable lately, and just kind of gently reflecting the behavior changes you're seeing. And with your own frustration, what I would recommend too is recognizing, right now is a really stressful time, and doing some self-care for yourself. You're seeing somebody you love and you care about struggle pretty significantly. And I don't know if this is related to, he's lost his job recently or something like that. But you're noticing behavior changes. And so just making these casual, gentle observations of this and saying, I just want you to feel better. I just want to help you. I don't want to push you to do something you don't want to, but I am concerned, and expressing that gently and in a non-threatening, non-judgmental way just at least opens that door. And I think that can sometimes be the hardest part for spouses or parents and clinicians at times, is you sometimes plant a seed, and it takes a while for that seedling to sprout into something you can see or that is tangible. And you have to kind of have faith in the process of offering that continual, gentle support, and trust that at some point that seed will sprout and that they'll accept the help. Because you can't force him into therapy. And for you, if it's getting to the point where you're really aggravated and upset and getting more and more and more frustrated, and your own kind of stress is rising, I do intakes for spouses all the time for this reason, who come in and say, my partner won't get help, I need to work on how I'm reacting to this because it's starting to stress me out. So that's also an option for you. But I would continue to just be the kind, loving, supportive spouse that you are, and plant that seed and keep watering it with those gentle statements, and don't force it.
Great. Yeah, that's a really interesting talking about, like, if you're getting aggravated about it, but to go and see someone yourself, to talk to somebody about it. That's really interesting. We do have one more question, and this one says, so you've talked about, like, feeling guilty or bad about feeling sad about, people that might be having a hard time. But I've been feeling really sad about everything that's happening in the world. So whenever I go on social media, I see, all of the things that are happening, and I just feel very helpless and out of control. And so what can I do to help with those feelings?
So you're experiencing a form of compassion fatigue. And that was actually one of the things I actually meant to touch on. So I'm glad you brought that up, was that when you're really empathic, everything in the world right now is just, it's like, you're just taking it all on and holding it all on your shoulders. And there's so much injustice in the world, and there's so much frustration and so much to be angry about. But the social media piece brings up a really good point. Get off social media. I cannot stress that enough. What I would recommend doing is not using social media, and instead picking a few websites, like news sites like New York Times, or I always recommend unbiased news sites. You can pick whichever ones you want, but picking some news sites that you check in once or twice a day to get the news, and not subject yourself to the honestly sometimes pretty hateful, stressful world of social media, and the opinionated world of social media can make things, it does it. I mean, I find the same thing when I log off Facebook. I'm like, I feel like my nerves are shot. I'm angry, I'm sad, I'm frustrated. And what I have found works for myself, and what a lot of my other therapist friends are doing, who are experiencing a lot of the same things that you just described, is we limit our time on social media for that reason. And we choose to get our information just straight from the news source. I don't want to hear anybody else's opinions. I don't want to see anybody else's response to anything, because that stresses me out. And it's hard to sometimes sort through all that noise on social media, right? All the, oh, you're an idiot if you think this, you're XYZ if this, it's all this all or nothing statements everywhere. And it's such toxic thought patterns just all over the place. And it weighs on you. It's heavy. And the best recommendation I have for you is to delete it from your phone and only check it maybe on like a computer if you have that, or move it to the fourth page of the apps you have on your phone, so that it's not right there in your face every day and you're not just habitually checking it. A social media detox is very helpful. And I think everyone should do them. And if I could get rid of one thing in the world, it would probably be social media. But so my recommendation would be to either limit your time, take a break from it, and get your news from different sources for the time being, just to help give your emotions a break. Because we're all kind of in this trauma response right now. I think with everything that's happening, we're in a communal trauma. And it's hard to get back to baseline when we're constantly seeing and being fed new images of things happening all over the world. You don't get a chance to really process them and de-escalate when you're constantly on social media being re-exposed to them. So a social media diet is my recommendation to you.
That sounds like a good recommendation. So that's all the time we've got today. So Melissa, thank you so much for your presentation, and thank you everyone who has attended today. No matter what you're facing in life, like if you're feeling overwhelmed or worried or stressed, Jefferson Center is here for you. We are open, we are accepting new clients, and accessing care is easier than ever with virtual appointments. You can visit our website at jcmh.org or follow us on Facebook for more resources and information. And you can also reach us by calling us at 303-425-0300. Thank you so much and have a great day.